Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. Barack Obama reiterated his pledge that the US would reconsider its strategy on Syria if it was found that Damascus had used chemical weapons. It follows the statement made last week by the US Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel. He said there was evidence that Bashar al-Assad's government used weapons loaded with nerve agents. Washington had previously warned that the use of so-called weapons would be a red line that Assad must not cross. At a press conference, Barack Obama did express caution about recent intelligence reports.
If I can establish in a way that not only the United States but also the international community feel confident is the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime, that is a game changer, because what that portends is potentially even more devastating attacks on civilians. By game changer, I mean that we would have to rethink the range of options that are available to us.
As well, Britain, France and Israel have said that there is evidence of chemical weapons being used. There is also criticism that the evidence is, quote, of low confidence, and claims that the agents may have been spilled accidentally by conventional shells detonating stray chemical stocks. What are the chances of chemical weapons being used in Syria? And what about if they're not being used, but the US convinces itself and the world that they are? What impact will that have on the spiraling conflict in Syria? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm joined here in the studio by Shashank Joshi. He's Research Fellow for the Royal United Services Institute. Also here in the studio is Danny Makki. He's co-founder of the group Syrian Youth in Britain. It's a group which supports a political solution to the crisis. On the line, I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Alistair Hay. He's a chemical weapons expert and Professor of Environmental Toxicology at the University of Leeds. And also on the line from Beirut is Shamin Nawani, Senior Associate at St Anthony's College, Oxford University. Shashank, I'd like to get your view. Barack Obama talks about making sure he's got the facts. That's what the American people would expect, he says. Why not wait until you have the full facts before you say there is evidence of chemical weapons?
I think there's two causes. First of all, there was pressure from allies. We had Israel, the United Kingdom and France all independently make these claims that chemical weapons had been used and put enormous pressure on the White House. I think the second concern was congressional pressure. The White House had written a letter to the US Congress, Senators McCain and Levin, both on the Armed Services Committee. These things get leaked. This information trickles out. And if it had come out and the White House hadn't made a statement by itself, they would have had to be firefighting, dealing with the position not on their own terms. And I think finally it's worth bearing in mind, even though the evidence is of low confidence, as you said, even though they don't have chain of custody, they don't know where their samples came from or when or where exposure may have occurred, they do still have to cater for the possibility this was intentional use. And so releasing the evidence in this way, or claims of the evidence, is also sending a signal to the regime, I imagine, or that's at least, I think, what they intend.
Shamin Nawani, so it's sending a signal to the regime. I mean, what do you make of that and the idea of the provenance, the chain of custody issue?
So much of this is a media war now. I agree with Shashank that so many people had leaked information about this, creating pressure where the U.S. political establishment felt they had to respond. Syria has been a media war almost from the start, and I think it's a shame that 2 years in we haven't pulled back. The discussions and events of the last week have been very dangerous, an escalation of the conflict in Syria potentially. The chain of custody is a very important issue. I mean, if you don't know who's held the sample in their hands and where the sample comes from, you can't even make the claim at this point. It's worth noting that this is very much actually what the nuclear issue in Iran is about, too. It's about allegations for about 9 years, the most intrusive weapons inspection program from the IAEA ever, based simply on allegations with varying degrees of confidence. So the international community can absolutely go bonkers on evidence as flimsy as this. This is what the danger is.
I'd just like to get the view of Alistair Hay, who's a chemical weapons expert. I mean, this term chain of custody, unless that is defined, it's very difficult to know whether the evidence is really there for chemical weapons.
Absolutely. I was involved in two investigations, one in 1988 and the other in 1992, where we were absolutely certain about the chain of custody, and this was getting samples back from northern Iraq. You have to be sure that the samples were held by certain individuals and that nobody could tamper with them, and that they are bona fide. And unless you know that, you always have to be a little skeptical about where they have come from.
Danny Makki from the group Syrian Youth in Britain. I mean, where does this put the position of the rebels at the moment? And what about the reaction to this news? Do you feel that they're trying to make a case for some kind of intervention?
Of course, definitely. Any identifying of a use of chemical weapons on rebel forces or Syrian opposition forces would ultimately be a pretext for foreign intervention, which is an issue which is very obvious. But the fact is, there is no real concrete evidence that chemical weapons have been used. It is still the source from which the soil samples came was from a Syrian opposition source and is not a direct British link to really justify that chemical weapons were used or the types which were used. And we have to really equate this here. So this is essentially an allegation and nothing really set in concrete. The concept of the United States of America is that they've always used the chemical weapons issue as a road to kind of more intervention in Syria, more interference, accusing the regime of using chemical weapons and using it to put more pressure on the Syrian government, also giving it another excuse to arm and fund the rebels. There is no concrete evidence of the chemical weapons being used, so this will put the United States in a more of a difficult situation in terms of their relations with the rebels. They can't really fund or arm the rebels even more at this current moment in time because of the Islamists present, and the fact that the rebel forces have such a level of anarchy in their internal ranks makes it even more difficult to really justify whether chemical weapons were used, or of the soil samples, or of a relative substantial concrete evidence to signify this.
Are chemical weapons being used in Syria? I'm discussing this with Shashank Joshi, Danny Makki, Alistair Hay and Shameen Nawani. But the US would dispute that they're arming the rebels. They're simply saying that they're providing non-military assistance.
Obama did state that he's moving towards funding and arming the opposition with lethal aid. And the concept is not whether America is doing so. It is America's regional allies which are funding and arming the Syrian opposition with lethal aid. Stinger missiles are reaching the rebels via Turkey. Saudi Arabia and Qatar have a fundamental role in providing the lethal armaments which the rebels need. The Americans provide humanitarian assistance which comes to the Syrian rebels in indirect means. But the main weapons are coming from Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Turkey, who are working under the auspice of the United States, thus not forcing a direct link between the United States and direct arming, which would mean a bigger source of intervention, especially for its own people.
In terms of the perception building, Shashank Joshi, and I suppose Shameen alluded to it, when Barack Obama says red line, what kind of purpose does that serve? Is that what kind of message is that trying to send out?
It's an effort at deterrence, simple as that. It was a red line that was issued with a view to averting any use of chemical weapons, and now averting it on any larger scale, if indeed it has occurred. I think it was probably done with great reluctance. They probably understood it would have painted them into a corner, as it has to some extent. The purpose, as you asked, is very simple, to deter the Assad regime from using its very substantial stockpile of chemical weapons. But
in a sense, it could have encouraged the escalation of violence. It also sends out a message that anything other than chemical weapons will be acceptable.
Indeed, and the Obama administration was criticised by a number of proponents of armed intervention for exactly that reason, that it signified chemical weapons were a class of weapons unto themselves, and that all measures short of that were going to be acceptable by American standards.
Shameen Nawani, what do you make of the term red line? Is it helpful?
No, I worry, in fact, about terms like red line being introduced into geopolitical discourse. It's a convenient soundbite. It's almost like a marketing soundbite. It sets a public discourse that is not necessarily relevant to what's very much happening on the ground. After all, who is the United States, or what is the United States to set red lines, in a country, in a region halfway across the world? How about red lines for Syrians who have been rejecting the militarization of the conflict and the internationalization of the conflict and sanctions from the start? Aren't Syrians entitled to set their own red lines, which would be backed by international law? I mean, how about the violation of their sovereignty and their territorial integrity? How about regime change operations inside Syria and on the borders of at least two states, Turkey and Jordan? How about aiding and abetting unlawful activities that have caused devastating material damage and the deaths of tens of thousands of Syrian civilians, until supply lines started opening up in early 2012 for the rebels, and the media was prepped to accept the militarization of the rebellion. We recall for a year before that, in 2011, we were fed this rubbish about peaceful protests and no weapons, rebels picking up weapons just to defend themselves. We now see clearly that wasn't the case. So until we were prepped to accept this militarization, deaths were, I think it was 5,000. In 1 year, it's increased by more than 10 times. How about that Syrian red line?
Your reaction to that, Shashank?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think it's worth emphasising the point that indeed the conflict has militarised greatly, but that it occurred after the enormous repression by the Assad regime. I think it's also worth returning to the earlier point. I find it bewildering that chemical weapons might be looked at as a mere pretext, given that for most people who are looking at the Obama administration, it's plain to see they are desperate to avoid finding a pretext and avoid finding a reason to get sucked in. And so the idea they're simply waiting for an excuse is untenable, of course. The French and the British have been pushing Washington to move in their direction and arm the rebels more overtly, directly, on a larger scale. And the White House has consistently rejected this, most notably last summer when all of Obama's national security advisors were pushing for this. So I think we're getting completely the wrong end of the stick in the administration's motivations, whatever you think of their decision-making.
Danny Makki, there is a point there, isn't there? I mean, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff asked or questioned how effective US military intervention might be, and they don't want intervention.
There is a fundamental
difference to do with that.
Between what the American people want and what the American government wants. The American people do not want intervention. However, the American government seeks to perpetuate its political interest in a geopolitical struggle in the Middle East.
So why did they reject the provision of arms last summer? Why did President Obama reject the plan put forward by all of his
and
national
likewise,
security?
why are they funding the Syrian armed rebels with Stinger missiles?
That's a straightforward question. Why did he reject the plan put forward by his chairman of the Joint Chiefs, by his CIA director, by his State Department chief? Why did he turn that down if that's the case?
They turned it down, but they provide assistance in different means. The fact is, America has a direct role in the Syria conflict. America directly leads to militarizing the conflict. When the Free Syrian Army were asked by the Syrian government to lay down their arms, Hillary Clinton stated live on air that the Free Syrian Army should not lay their arms down. They should fight the Syrian government. America have a primary role in agitating the Syria conflict. To suggest otherwise is naive.
The U.S. has this idea that the U.S. has not intervened in this conflict is absolutely ridiculous. The U.S. military has made a decision after Iraq and Afghanistan that they will not get directly involved in conflicts, in boots on the ground. However, that they will use other people's money and other people's manpower to do so. And the U.S. has funded the Syrian so-called revolutions to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars, and will incrementally increase that, but don't really need to because you have a lot of funding coming from U.S. allies, Saudi Arabia and Qatar and others, obviously.
I'd just like to get back on the line, Alistair Hay, chemical weapons expert, just on the allegations of chemical weapons. And I suppose we did see the reports in the Times last week about physical evidence that nerve agents had been used, reports that it happened in 3 places. Now, these haven't been verified, but if it transpires that they were used in 3 places, what's the significance of this? Does this suggest a coordinated attack? Does it suggest a degree of command and control? I mean, what do you think?
Well, I think it suggests a coordinated attack. If indeed the evidence is cast iron, the difficulty is always going to be getting that degree of proof. At this stage, we really don't know what the evidence is. We have nods and winks and leaks, but nothing has actually been put out in the public domain that others can have a look at and scrutinize. So we don't have the information that the United States, for example, had with Colin Powell when he was making his claims before the intervention in Iraq back in 2003. So we need to see what this evidence is. And I agree that really the message that is being sent to Syria is don't use these things, don't use chemical weapons. And can I just also say that it is illegal to use these. There are 188 countries that have signed the Chemical Weapons Convention, and in signing that they agree not to use chemical weapons and to get rid of their stocks. And there is customary international law which prohibits the use of these. And you do need to have governments that support the convention saying to others who haven't yet signed, and Syria hasn't signed, neither has Israel nor Egypt, saying to them that you do not use chemical weapons, it is illegal to do that, and there are implications if you do.
But on the point of concrete evidence, which is still obviously is lacking at the moment, I mean, is it unusual that if these reports are to be believed, that it was used in such small quantities? I guess when we think of chemical weapons, we think of them being used in a widespread manner, don't we, affecting thousands and thousands of people across a wide area. I mean, is this unusual in your view?
Yes, it is. I mean, the history from the First World War and also from the use in Iraq by the Iraqis against the Iranians and the Kurds is it was large-scale use. So whether it is the Syrian regime or somebody else doing sort of probing attacks, trying to see what the implications are or how the world will react, something we really don't know. Much of what could have been achieved with the use of these low-grade incidents, if they were chemical weapons incidents, could just as easily have been achieved using explosives.
But what about the strategic value? I mean, is the strategic value more in tune with, I suppose, demoralizing the population, sending a message of fear, even if it's used in very, very low quantities?
Well, it does have that effect, but the demoralizing effect which we saw in northern Iraq when the Kurds were attacked was massive use, many thousands of deaths, and the result was millions of people fleeing. Here, if it's sort of low-grade use, I don't think it has that same psychological impact.
Danny Makki from the group Syrian Youth in Britain, there is the possibility, isn't there, that that red line that we've referred to, Bashar al-Assad is trying to test it. He's trying to see what kind of reaction he can get. He's perhaps trying to foster confidence among his own forces. That's a possibility, isn't it?
I don't really think that using chemical weapons would muster support amongst his own forces. The question is, what would the Syrian government have to gain by using chemical weapons? The majority of the world is against them. They seek an excuse to arm the rebels. You could argue by using chemical weapons, he would only make the international call for him to resign and leave power even bigger.
The majority of the world is also against, of course, launching Scud missiles into population centres.
Also, the majority of the world is against Al-Qaeda committing terrorist atrocities in Damascus on a day-to-day basis, which is funded directly by the Americans. As well, one other issue.
Paranoia.
Why is this not the ultimate hypocrisy of the issue? When the United States are the only country who've used chemical weapons of mass destruction in Japan, they've used depleted uranium in Iraq, which is much bigger than anything which has been used in Syria. So the last country to really give lessons on using weapons of mass destruction is the United States of America.
But it is illegal to use chemical weapons. They mustn't be used under any circumstances.
So the ultimate question is, who is using them? Everyone keeps stating that the government is using them. However, we saw pictures and videos for the rebel forces using chemical weapons on rabbits. This was highly documented on almost every mainstream media outlet, using chemical weapons on rabbits and threatening minorities with chemical weapon attacks. You could argue that chemical weapons could get to rebel forces from Turkey by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, so we can't really accuse the government of something they might have not done.
They don't have chemical weapons, so how would they get to them from Qatar and Saudi Arabia?
Well, Turkey don't have chemical weapons, and there aren't defected people who could possibly give rebels chemical weapons. And the fact that you argue that against Bashar al-Assad, it's not an issue of the Syrian president himself. No one can deny the fact that there are extremist Islamist movements in Syria now. And
certainly, no doubt.
And there is no doubt, and the fact that you belittle it shows that the actual reality in the ground is very different to what is being portrayed by mass media.
Shashank Joshi, do you want to respond to that?
First of all, I think we should be clear and honest. The possibility of use by rebels or accidental exposure should not be ruled out. I think it's important that we recognise the weakness of our evidence. I do, however, think common sense would dictate the regime is far, far likelier to have used them in this instance in these documented cases.
Alistair Hay.
What would it gain?
Can I just put this to Alistair Hay and then I'll ask Shameen again. There is the possibility that this could have been spilt accidentally. It could have come from conventional shells detonating stray chemical stocks. It could have come from the rebels, but we're not really going to know until the veracity of these claims are proved.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And this is why it would be helpful if the United Nations team could go in, and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has experts who could go in and take samples on the ground. But of course they need to have guarantees about their security, and they need to have access to the sites where they want to test. And that, as I understand it, hasn't happened yet. But I just want also to say about arming of the rebels with chemical agents, it is not in the interests of Turkey or Qatar or any of these other countries to provide the rebels with chemical weapons. These countries have signed this international convention, and it would certainly never be in their interest to arm other countries or indeed the rebels with chemical weapons.
Well, Shameen Nawani, there were allegations of chemical weapons attacks in Aleppo in March, Homs in December. The Syrian government wants the UN team to probe only the Aleppo attack. They're not allowing unfettered access to UN investigators. Bashar al-Assad needs to do that, doesn't he?
No, I disagree. And I think this is, again, there are parallels with the Iranian nuclear scenario because, you have an allegation. It's not backed up with evidence. Evidence is not being shown to Iran, okay? And every time the IAEA, very much, under the thumb of the United States and its allies, decides that something has to be investigated, like the Parchin, so-called military facility, Iran does not have to open its country up and borders up to that kind of scrutiny by foreign governments, because that information does get passed on. So no, this is a sovereign state, and it is under siege. So absolutely not. And I think the government did the right thing. There was a highly publicized incident in Aleppo with casualties and victims and witnesses that was not disputed by any side, and so they invited the UN to come and check. And then immediately a whole bunch of other incidents supposedly cropped up, and this is politics. The ridiculous idea that the Syrian government is the party most likely to use this weapon is incorrect. The Syrian government has no motive to use weapons like this. The Syrian government would risk losing its international alliances with Russia and China and Iran and other countries. It would legitimize the idea that you could have foreign intervention in Syria. If anything, the Syrian government has calibrated its military responses from the beginning of this conflict to minimize the risk of foreign intervention. In fact, quite the contrary. It is in the interest of the rebels, who were constantly complaining of being underfunded and underarmed, to create a pretext for foreign intervention. And let's not pretend that the rebels cannot get hands on any of these things. Where there's a will, there's a way. And Iraq, which borders Syria, a place where thousands of jihadists and other Islamists have come across the border to aid the Syrian rebellion, are bringing with them the know-how that they gained fighting a U.S. occupation. And included in the know-how, incidentally, is the use of explosive devices in the last decade that include chlorine gas, sarin gas-based munitions. So you can't say that the government has any interest in using chemical weapons. There is no military advantage whatsoever to use chemical weapons. They are not going to be able to have any military victories from this. They're not going to be able to kill a lot of people, because it would then be evident that they're using chemical gases. And let me just bring up one incident that happened sometime late last year, but when there was a big ruckus about potential chemical weapons use in Syria late last year, the Syrian army apparently used this to their advantage by dispersing white powders from a helicopter in an area. Rebels thought, given the press, that perhaps this was chemical weapons, ran into an open area in which they were killed. And it was chalk. Okay, so if they wanted to put fear in people, they can use white chalk.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing, did Syria use chemical weapons? With me is Shashank Joshi, Research Fellow for the Royal United Services Institute. Danny Makki, co-founder of the group Syrian Youth in Britain. And on the line we have Professor Alistair Hay. He's a chemical weapons expert and Professor of Environmental Toxicology at the University of Leeds. And also on the line from Beirut is Shameen Nawani, who's a Middle East analyst and Senior Associate at St Antony's College, Oxford. I'd just like to quickly get the response from Alistair Hay about that point raised by Shameen, the possibility of this coming from across the border in Iraq. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, it's always possible to get chlorine. Sarin is a much more difficult agent. To make it, you really need very, very good laboratory facilities and production facilities, and then to weaponize it. So it is a skill that is in very short supply, and I would be very skeptical that the rebels were able to manufacture their own.
But it's entirely possible, correct?
You can find information about the recipes for doing these things, but learning how to detonate is much more difficult. We saw that with the Om Shinrikyo cult in Japan in 1995 when they released these agents in the Tokyo Underground. They didn't have the munitions for doing that. They simply carried some liquid sarin in plastic bags, used umbrella tips to sort of break the bags, and then just ran away. So weaponizing these things is much, much more difficult. It's more likely, I think, that if the rebels did use these things or did have access, it would be to the Syrian stockpile. But as we have heard from the Syrian regime, whether this is true or not, the weapons are very closely guarded.
Just to follow up on that, we're running out of time, but Alistair Hay, I mean, at the moment, there is a UN investigation going on, but if they're not allowed into the country, does it serve much use?
No, like the rest of us then, you're simply looking at listening to allegations, looking at evidence where you might have all sorts of questions about chain of custody and various other things. If you want to get that good evidence, then you need to be able to go in and have the inspectors visit particular sites and so on. But even then, as we saw from the almost dozen investigations that the UN did in Iraq and Iran in the 1980s, you can never be absolutely sure who released the agents.
Danny Makki, it's spreading across borders. Do you see any role that Britain can play in this?
Okay, if Britain really wants to play a role which is based on bringing peace and security and stability back to Syria, they should stop discussing the concept of arming the opposition, the majority of which are now extremists, and this is very obvious. What Britain should do is lobby the regional Arab countries to stop funding the Syrian opposition and funneling weapons to them, to create a big political solution on a regional scale, to have elections inside of Syria for a transition to a democracy with the United Nations as an observer inside of Syria. Britain could easily play this role, but Britain should shy from taking an antagonistic and confrontational stance towards the Syrian government, as they have no interest in an extremist Syria. They have more of an interest in a democratic Syria. So the best way to go about this is to promote a political solution between all sides, to promote dialogue between Syrians, and it has to be a Syrian-led political process which safeguards Syria's internal sovereignty and internal integrity as a state. There can be no violation of Syria's sovereignty. So what Britain should be doing is playing as a role of a peacemaker, a moderator between the warring sides in Syria, as opposed to a side which would want to arm the opposition and play an agitating role.
Shashank Joshi, a political solution hasn't worked yet.
No, and one of the reasons for that is that Russia and China and Iran have simply refused to pressure Assad to make the necessary concessions that would be suitable to begin such a process. It's fairly clear that's one of the causes. And I also hate to break the news, but Syria has no sovereignty at this point. It's a state where there's a large popular uprising, indeed, including Islamists and extremists in its ranks, and the state is simply falling apart.
And just on the point of the Islamists, what do you make, Danny, about the declaration of allegiance to Al-Qaeda by Jabhat al-Nusra?
We have been warning about this for some time, but the Western countries and the Western political leaders have not seen this. They've discussed the concept of a peaceful democratic uprising against a dictatorial government. If this is truly the case, why would Al-Qaeda be in Syria? Why would they be the biggest rebel fighting force on the ground at this current moment in time? Why would they be using sectarian chants and threatening minorities? It is not a peaceful uprising, and the fact that it is
that's quite true.
It's a conflict. Yeah. It's nowhere near a peaceful uprising, and it's about time Western countries stopped viewing this from a humanitarian perspective, because the rebel forces are using the same tactics of brutality which the West accused the government of. So in terms of violence and crimes, there is a level playing field.
Shashank Joshi, I'll give the last word to you.
I'm afraid the idea that they're on an equivalent scale is preposterous. They're simply not. The regime has far more firepower and inflicts far more damage on non-combatants.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We've sadly run out of time. I'd just like to finish by thanking my guests, Danny Makki, who's the co-founder of the group Syrian Youth in Britain. Also here in the studio, Shashank Joshi, Research Fellow for the Royal United Services Institute. On the line from Beirut, Shamin Nawani, who's an analyst and senior associate at St Antony's College, Oxford, and also Professor Alistair Hay, who's a chemical weapons expert and Professor of Environmental Toxicology at the University of Leeds. Thank you all very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.